There's been some comments lately in comics that, hey, the monthly model is dying. We really need to go to original graphic novels and kind of go that route. And, like any plan, well, first off, I don't think that's a good plan. The main reason I don't think that's a good plan is because I don't think that anyone really knows how to execute it. Now, I will grant you, and it's a true statement, if you go into kind of the big booksellers, you go into Target or Walmart, wherever it happens to be, you'll see some graphic novels on the shelf there, and that appears to be working out pretty damn well for Scholastic. But I'm not convinced that Marvel and DC and Image and a lot of these companies really know how to execute that plan. I think that, in fact, odds are they would fail at it. So let's talk about what would need to happen in order for that plan to be successful. Hey, everybody, this is Perch. This is a case where I welcome new ideas coming into comics. I think they're great. I think more people should be thinking about them. And the old adage, like, there is no dumb idea. Well, I mean, people say that to be nice, but in reality, there are plenty of dumb ideas. And there, there always have been, always will be. But you want to be nice about things. You try to be nice. One of the ideas that's come up a lot lately is to say, the comic industry is broken. It's funny how, by the way, it's all over the map. It's a scatter shot. It's basically who people are responding to. If an angry fan is saying comic industry is failing, then a bunch of people come out of the woodwork and say the comic industry is doing better than ever before. It's doing great. If DC starts to lay off people, it's like, well, here's clearly an indication the comic industry is broken. We need a union. And if a outsider comes in and talks about the finances, it's like, well, the comic shop market and the floppies are dying, but we'll all go OGN. Anyway, there's always this kind of moving target of how the comic industry is actually doing. And the reality is, as we've talked about before, I'm not going to go into that. There's other videos where, how is the comic industry doing? There's like 30 videos at this point that I've made on that topic. But one of the ideas that's come up a lot is basically saying, okay, let's assume that the monthly floppy market is coming to an end. The comic shop is not going to survive, and if the comic shop's not going to survive, we're looking around. Digital, which was the big savior some time ago, has not manifested itself as being worth thinking about, and the floppy market, it doesn't work in the newsstand. There isn't a newsstand that can consume the floppy market like it did 30 years ago. So what are comics to do? And that's where it comes down to, well, that we need to get to OGNs. We need to get to more trade paperbacks. We need to get to more, bigger volumes. And people say that because they see what any of us can see. They go into a Walmart or they go into a bookstore and they see the infusion of manga, and they see the scholastic books there, and they see that market growing quite rapidly. And then they make one leap of judgment that I think creates a false positive. They say, hey, if we're looking at people under 20, they all seem to gravitate toward books, toward original graphic novels, toward books. They're not going for comics, and so therefore comics must be dying. And I think that's why I say it's a false positive is because it's making a couple judgments based on incomplete data. Comics floppies aren't sold everywhere. They're sold in comic shops. And comic shops are not, frequent everywhere. We're increasingly a car society. People are not riding their bikes around or walking around. They're driving their cars. And the reality is, if right now I said to you, hey, the only way to get comics is if you walk or bike to your comic shop, you can't take a car, I think 90% of my audience would be done at that point, because reality is there's not a comic shop near you or near enough to you. So if you think about that to kids, particularly kids who can't drive yet, then yeah, in the past they could go into a 7-Eleven, a grocery store, wherever it happened to be, they could get their comics. They cannot do that today. So now they've got to convince the parents to take them to a comic shop if they want to consume monthly comics. So they're not. And in many cases, that age group doesn't even know that either the comic shop or the monthly comics exist. Or if they do, it's kind of this vague idea. So that doesn't necessarily, though, that doesn't mean that the floppy is a dead product that can't survive. it might survive quite well. If suddenly, you were selling it in the grocery store, we would see a pop in floppy numbers. I don't think that we can completely draw a conclusion yet that people are no longer interested in floppies. I think it's people can't get a hold of them, and there's a distribution and a getting it to the hands of consumers problem, not necessarily an interest problem. Now, there may still be. I'm just saying the data that we've worked with is not proving out the case one way or another. So the leap that people take is if the floppies are dead, then we have to go OGN. And when they look at Walmart and they see all these OGNs on the shelf there, particularly for YA, they're like, okay, that's the direction. That's where we need to go. So I don't necessarily think that's a wrong conclusion, but it is, again, taking a lot of bits of data that may not all go together and throwing it into one spot. Scholastic and others, Penguin and some others in that vein, they know they can't sell, or they believe they can't sell floppies into a Walmart, so they went with books because the book session still exists. Manga is sold in bookshops in a collected or trade form, but you do have you don't see Shonen Jump showing up in Target or in Barnes and Noble. But in its originating country, in Japan, you do have plenty of monthly or weekly activities still happening. It's just in the U.S. because of the distribution and the way the comics are coming over here. You don't have that. It's not feasible for a weekly comic to be sent and delivered and translated and all the rest. Now, to the point, because somebody will mention it. Yes, in Japan, by and large, a lot of graphic novels, a lot of this material have consolidated into graphic novels and other pieces as well. It's not like there's a thriving, healthy monthly market over there. It tends to be weekly collected or really collected in a trade style. I don't feel like I'm describing this well, but at any rate, it's a different market, I guess is my point. And some parts of that market are not making its way over here that might lead people to believe a slightly different conclusion. Marvel and DC and Image and the others, I don't think they have a good handle on what this means. And I say that because as you look at the collections, there's not a standard collection format that's being offered. It tends to be all over the place in both size, in price point, in cut, in everything else. They're clearly still experimenting heavily on what to do with the graphic novels and with the trades. They have not settled on a standard product. And because they haven't settled on a standard product, I'm dubious of their ability to really enter a marketplace that's new to them and compete there in a reasonable way. Think about it for a second. I mean, if you're Marvel and after a year you take stock and you say, okay, well, last year, Absolute Carnage was our best event, and House of X Powers of 10 was those two collections clearly, above and beyond the others. That seemed to be what works. Let's put them in a, format that is under $20 and sell them. Let's offer them out to Target, and they can put on the book stands, the shelf right next to other things. Why aren't they doing that? In many cases, they're doing some YA stuff through some other licensors. They're not putting that out in the market. Every now and then, you'll see a collection of an event or something show up in one of those kinds of shops, but typically that stuff is reserved for your Barnes and Noble, your bookstores. It doesn't go into the big box chains. And why? Why can't White Knight, as a collected edition, be sold in Walmart? Do you think people would be interested in it? Of course people would be interested in it there. If the price point was under $20, it would sell. It would probably sell quite well. But the fact that it's not there, or rarely there, or infrequently there, indicates a weird problem. Marvel and DC and Image and the others as well, they are churning out more than enough material to choke Scholastic out of the mix. There's a massive amount of content that's being produced, but yet you don't see someone at the big two or three who is in charge of really taking these comics, packaging them up in a format and a presentation that makes sense for that market, that makes sense for the Walmart market, and working to get those into the store there. And why not? Do you think that Walmart wouldn't be interested if you showed up and said, "Hey, Walmart, here is the collected trade paperback for White Knight, and it is $14.95. We've got it all packaged up together, and it can sit on the shelf in your book area, and it's Batman, and who doesn't like Batman? And there you go. You think Walmart wouldn't take that product? Of course they would take that product. Look at some of the garbage that's on the shelves of Walmart and Target where the graphic novel business is concerned, and yet they're not there. Why? I don't have the answer to that. I've asked many times, and the answer I've often got back is either, oh, we do that from time to time, with no explanation of why from time to time, or I get the explanation of, that's outside of my business. That's a different group. Okay, well, what group? If you work at Marvel and DC and you're in the publishing kind of arm, you're in that area, you're in that department. Why in the hell wouldn't you start doing this? I mean, even if you were kind of a lowly worker and you weren't told to do this, why wouldn't you be picking up the phone and trying to get one of the big chains to put Absolute Carnage in there in the store? I mean, if you could come back to your bosses or wherever at Marvel and say, hey, I've got Walmart willing to take a trade paperback every 3 months, basically for a year of a collected whatever we want to put in that collection. We just got to market it well. It's got to have good trade dress and something on the side. Got to be under a $20 price point, but they're willing to commit to 500,000 units. I mean, I think they would. In fact, I'm not just think. I'm positive they would. Now, some of the more mature stuff, I think like Saga or some of that would have more troubles. Absolutely, you definitely have the issue of is the content fit, but the bar for if the content fits or not is not it has to appeal to an under 12 audience. It is, does this thing have really bad swears and nudity in it? If it does, that's going to be a problem. Otherwise, it doesn't matter. Go for it. Most comics being produced would easily fit under that bar. So why don't they? These are the reasons why when I hear people say, hey, the monthly floppy market is dying, we need to just cancel them all and go to OGNs, I worry about it because I don't think the comic publishers know how to execute on that plan. I don't think they know how to do it to not just tip over their whole business. And I do think they ought to invest some serious time into figuring it out. And I think there's plenty of people who know how to do it that they could ask for help with. But right now, it feels like a lot of people are complaining and saying this is what we should do, but nobody is really, going after that that market with any kind of seriousness. So, here we are, stuck in limbo. I think the brief times when we've seen OGNs come out of these companies, Marvel or DC, they typically have they've failed, and in many cases they're not marketed at all, which gets to other problems. Or they produce an OGN, but then their distribution source for it is back to the comic shops. You look at this. There's a little comic that Rick Remender did. It was one of his final ones called Rage of Ultron. Does anybody remember that comic? It was easy to ignore because it was marketed absolutely terribly to the comic shops. They weren't sure what they were getting. It was one of the worst marketed and distributed things that they have done. It was kind of it was not distributed outside the comic shops. And it wound up being this weird little awkward thing that somehow got less pickup than an annual. And it was a pretty key story. It involved Hank Pym and Ultron fusing, which was going to be a big deal down the road. It was one of Remender's last things that he did. It featured kind of the Avengers, which was, I hear is a hot property. And yet it went absolutely nowhere. Why? More often than not, that's the result. So, again, my argument here is not that, they shouldn't pursue this market. My argument is I don't think they know how to. And unless they figure that out, unless they, learn how to, they should not. Don't blow up your market before you have established you can go compete in a new one. What do you think? Let me know your thoughts on all this. Would you prefer to read OGNs and trades rather than floppies? If they canceled all the floppies and went, graphic novels and they did a good job with it, would you be just as happy or would you be upset? What's your take on all this? Leave a comment below. Like, subscribe, click the bell for notifications, send me an email, follow me on social media. But most importantly, thanks for listening.